Good afternoon, everybody. And welcome to a talk by Professor Vijay Prashad entitled The Geopolitics of Iran's Nuclear Program. Certainly a hot topic. And he's just come from the US, so presumably he'll have a lot of hot gossip for us in terms of whether the deal is done or not. You have all the answers. Vijay, I think, is very well known here at AUB and at IFI, so I'll keep my introduction quite short. Of course, he's a research fellow here at IFI in the UN and the Arab World Program, which I direct. My name is Karim Makdisi, by the way. He's also formerly, as of last year, he was the Edward Said Chair at the Center for American Studies, also at AUB. Otherwise, his full-time job really is that he's the George and Martha Kellner Chair of South Asian History and Professor of International Studies in Trinity College, that's in Connecticut in the United States. He's a columnist for all sorts of newspapers, including Frontline in India and Al Arabi Al Jadid, Qatar-based. And he's a regular columnist for the leading Indian daily, The Hindu. He's also chief editor of the Leftward Books in New Delhi, and is writing or co-editing a whole series of books which are, just this year, which are too many to mention, including book, The New Arab Cold War, Imperial Power and Its Rivals. He's also co-editing with myself a book tentatively called The Land of Blue Helmets, UN and the Arab World, which should come out later this year. So without further ado, please help me welcome Vijay.
Please. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I just wanted to take a minute to say that for the fraternity of journalists, it's a great maybe pity or tragedy that our colleague was arrested in Amman, Jordan yesterday, Rula Amin, who is in the middle of what appears to be a custody battle, but I think perhaps is extrajudicial use of power in Jordan, and hope very much that she is released from prison immediately, I hope, and that the ruling which was on her behalf is upheld. So please keep in your thoughts Rula Amin, who's a fantastic, compassionate journalist, has spent, I think, 15 years in Beirut, reporting for many places, but of course Al Jazeera. So keep her in your mind and follow the story, and if you're on social media, I hope you'll contribute to the groundswell of opinion that might put pressure on the Jordanian institutions to act with some integrity. So, on the side. Well, you know, I'll just tell you my thesis of the talk. It's a hydraulic thesis, so I just want to put that out there. The thesis is 2 songs. The first song was sung by John McCain during his presidential run, when he decided to channel the Beach Boys, and to the tune of Barbaran, he sang, "Bomb, bomb, Iran, bomb, bomb, Iran." I don't know if you remember this. It was a strange moment for an American presidential candidate to, you know, be like a character from Saturday Night Live, but John McCain has this way of self-parodying himself. Oh, well, that's a thing, he's a self-parody. Well, I'm looking forward to the next YouTube sensation from him, when he will turn to the Duran Duran song from the 1980s, which some of you may remember is, you know, of course, I ran so far away, couldn't get away. So that's the arc of what I'm going to suggest. This deal, which has been, as you know, in the works for, you know, in a way for a decade, of course shorter than that, until the Omani government provided the mailbox for Iran and the United States to formally begin their discussions. It's a shorter time frame, but really this has been there for a long while. This deal is substantially over. As John Kerry put it, I think in a very muted way, he said that the technical issues have been settled, and now there are what he called political matters. It was, I think, important for people who watch these things, you know, like people read tea leaves, that the first flight that John Kerry took from Geneva was to Riyadh. And he arrives at King Abdulaziz Airport, goes in, sees the important people, and a conversation begins. It's also interesting that not long thereafter, from Pakistan. He's very used to having this happen to him. But Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was summoned to Riyadh, and I'm going to talk about that later. And the summoning of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif from Islamabad to come and see the king has a very important element, perhaps, in the tea leaf reading. So I think this deal is substantially over. I'm going to suggest in a little bit that the outliers to this deal, interestingly, are perhaps going to be Turkey and Israel. Israel, remarkably, to my mind, and Iran are in a way in which dialectical unities sometimes do this, are switching places, where Iran is beginning to seem on the world stage a little more reasonable, Israel is beginning to seem a little more unreasonable, Israel is beginning to seem more like a theocratic religious state, and Iran is beginning to seem, well, you know, whatever Iran can begin to seem like. So there is a strange momentum going on, and maybe we can return to that, these outliers, you know, in a little bit. So the first thing I want to talk about is broadly the context of the Iranian nuclear program, just to get that out of the way so that there's no, I think, misunderstanding about that. Iran has a very old program which goes back to the 1950s. It's a program that begins in the Atoms for Peace process that was pushed largely by the US government, in other words, to provide countries, if they joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty, 1957, to provide them with nuclear material so that they can have a civilian program. By the way, I oppose, just for the record, I hate all nuclear programs, civilian, military, whatever, but this is the nature of international law, that you provide them with material for a civilian nuclear program, and then they have to, sort of suggest they will not proliferate the material or the technology, and therefore they will also not move for any kind of weaponization of nuclear material. Iran duly signed the NPT, in 1958. The United States government provided much of the technology, also the funding. It's that interesting way in which America funds these things. America provides funding through taxpayer money, and then private American companies come and build, the power, whatever the materials that need to be built. So this was the process, and Iran continued with this till 1979, when, of course, in the tumult of the Iranian Revolution, the program was largely suspended and, went to seed. So let me stop there for a minute and give you a parallel example. India in 1957 refused to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, saying that this was a violation of sovereignty, and using, I think, a pretty decent argument of what they called nuclear apartheid. For instance, they argued, why is it that the countries with nuclear bombs are allowed to maintain them, whereas the rest of us have to surrender the right to have nuclear weapons? This seems to be the recipe for an unequal world, and so we are not going to sign the NPT. Meanwhile, India illegally began to, a nuclear project in the 1960s, and in 1974, very dramatically tested nuclear weapons. Not a civilian program, but a weapons program. This was in 1974. There was some pressure on India at the time, but India was lucky. It had just signed with the Soviet Union the Indo-Soviet Peace Agreement of 1970, Friendship Agreement of 1971, and that gave India some breathing room. The nuclear program continued. Materials came from various places, a lot of it indigenously manufactured. And then finally, when the Soviet Union collapsed, by the time the program was fairly well developed. India didn't sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Agreement, again saying that it was an unequal apartheid-like treaty. In 1998, for the second time, tested nuclear weapons again. These are two nuclear weapons tests, no ambiguity. I'm not even going to use the Israel case as a parallel. I'm just suggesting the India story, because it's very interesting that then, after 2003, which is going to become an important year for the Iran case, after 2003, the Bush administration sends envoys to India and says, we would like to bring you out of the nuclear cold. Remember, India is not a signatory to any international nuclear treaty, despite being on the executive board of the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's one of the inconsistencies in the world architecture. You can have no signature on a treaty, and yet you can have a position of responsibility in the IAEA. At any rate, the United States sent envoys. Condoleezza Rice arrives in India, and she says, we would like to have a civilian program for you. We'd like to, vouch for you in the nuclear suppliers group, which is what is going to provide the material for reactors, and also we're going to make sure you get any advanced technology you need. Now, interestingly, the quid pro quo offered by the Bush administration was, if you do this, if we do this for you, you have to vote against Iran in the International Atomic Energy Agency meetings on non-compliance of Iran on certain measures that the IAEA had put in place for Iran. I just want you to think about this for a minute. Here's a rogue nuclear state, my country, India, which has signed no agreement, which has a nuclear weapons program, has twice tested a weapon, and in 2005 signs a strategic agreement with the United States, where the United States will provide India with political and diplomatic backing at the highest level for India to be out of the nuclear cold. Meanwhile, it has to vote against a country that is a signatory to the international agreements and within a frame of a range of compliance is yet within the treaty, meaning they were not so far out of the treaty range. No country complies 100%. No country says, come and look at everything. They always say there's a door which you can't open, as a way to protect sovereignty. It may be silly, it's a childish game. The door is actually behind it, there's cleaning supplies, but they still play this game. Or behind the door is a weapons program. We don't know, but nonetheless they are within a treaty compliance framework, whereas India was not. In other words, the objection to Iran's program, just to underline this, was not about international law. It was always about politics. It was always about the nature or character of the government in Iran. Could it be allowed to have a weapon? Therefore, Iran was not to be allowed because the West had decreed that its character was wrong. In other words, this is not the UN Charter as you know it. This is not about following the letter of, say, the IAEA or the NPT or whatever. This is about a certain group of countries deciding who has the moral character certificate to have a nuclear program, whether civilian or weapon, and who does not get a moral character certificate. This is a perfectly reasonable way to run the world, but perhaps for that one needs to revise the UN Charter in compliance with this way of running the world, if that indeed is the way. I'm not trying to be naive here. I'm not saying that the world should be run by law and it's run this way. I just want to suggest that this particular instance is entirely about politics and about who gets to determine who should have a program and who shouldn't. Well, the second point I want to make along with this is that in order to hem in Iran, to push it to, in a sense, to do what? To roll back entirely on the nuclear program, to stop processing material to X level. It's very interesting where the goalposts are. Different people have different understandings of the goalposts. Perhaps the clearest depiction of the goalpost was when Mr. Netanyahu went to the General Assembly, a year ago, with the drawing of the bomb, and he drew the red line. He says, that's the red line, it cannot be crossed. But actually, did he really mean that the red line was below the entire drawing? It's not clear what they mean by, limiting Iran's access to a nuclear program. At any rate, in order to pressure Iran, the strategy of, bomb Iran was not directly on the cards. The Obama administration doesn't have the temperament always to bomb or go into what it sees as intractable conflicts. It likes a little aerial bombardment here and there, but is loath to do anything beyond that. Therefore, the sanctions regime was the most important weapon of the West against Iran. Now, I had written a note for IFI on India's Iran policy, where it was interesting that right through this period when India is voting against Iran in the IAEA, and by the way, this is not a third-rate country being asked to vote against Iran. They needed what the United States ambassador in Delhi, David Mulford, had said was that the reason to get India to vote is much more significant than the one vote in the IAEA. India retains a kind of moral authority in the G77, in the non-aligned movement. It retains some moral authority. And if India breaks ranks with the rest of the world, this is going to give cover to other countries to come out and also say Iran should not have a nuclear program. So India's vote was essential, but at the same time, as they were pushing India to vote in this way, India-Iran trade was continuing. And it was continuing because Iran has oil and natural gas, and India is entirely energy reliant and had been importing oil from Iran, a very large, 12-13% of Indian energy was coming from Iran. The Saudis at the time in the 2000s said we'll substitute for Iranian oil, but as I learned very quickly from the Indian Oil Ministry, from the ONGC, the parastatal company, that there are different kinds of oil. I didn't know that, not having covered the energy sector, and that we'd have to change our processing units to deal with the different oil. It's much cheaper for us in the medium term to continue to buy Iranian oil. The problem was the West had by then, because the main financial network in the world called the SWIFT network is based in Brussels, the West had, through pressure on the EU and on the SWIFT network, cut Iran off the SWIFT network. India had been buying Iranian oil through a bank in Turkey, the Halk Bank. That route was closed down. Then India and Iran cut a deal where India bought oil and paid Iran in rupees in Indian banks. The Iranians have a problem. They prefer to buy American wheat, even till today. It's a bizarre thing. They thought Indian wheat is inferior. It's a bizarre problem. But anyway, India had nothing to sell Iran. The only thing was pharmaceuticals. Indian pharmaceutical industry had a problem. They didn't want to sell entirely to Iran because they rely on the off-patent market in the United States to make their money. So all these contradictions aside, the removal of Iran from the SWIFT network was perhaps the biggest blow to Iran financially. It could not trade or deal with other countries. Now, why I raised the sanctions issue is that was the most potent or powerful Western weapon against Iran, in which the SWIFT was a very important, lever. Meanwhile, on the side, in the last finance ministerial meeting of the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they've begun to discuss over the last 3-4 years a new financial architecture. You might follow this or may not, but over the Ukraine crisis, the West has threatened to remove Russia from the SWIFT network. And when this threat was made at this finance ministerial, the Russians floated the idea of not only having created a new development bank, the so-called BRICS bank, not only creating in the very short term BRICS ratings agencies to supplant Standards & Poor and Moody's, but perhaps to create a BRICS-based financial transaction network to substitute from SWIFT. In other words, what this might mean is the most potent weapon that the West has of economic sanctions has an expiry date. That if the SWIFT network is supplanted by a BRICS kind of financial network in 5-10 years, then some of the toolkit of the West for economic sanctions will not be as powerful as they would be. For instance, the BRICS Bank already will provide short-term funding, what the IMF used to do. If there is a liquidity problem for a country, the BRICS banks will have a window to provide liquidity to states which are running into trouble. And they would have no problem opening the window for Iran. So this economic sanctions, the most potent weapon, has an expiry date, which I think everybody knows. I mean, it's clear in Washington that there is awareness that this most potent weapon may not be powerful forever. Now, if I jump further and talk a little bit about the question of Iran gas, I don't know how many of you follow, I mean, I'm obsessed with trains, so I follow the Great Asian Train development, where this used to be a dream for people from the 1950s. The United Nations had a meeting about it, I think in Kyrgyzstan or somewhere in 1954, to design a train that was the southern route of the Grand Siberian Railroad that would go from the Chinese coastline out to perhaps Beirut. That was the idea. Now this train is being built. It's going from Lake Van over across northern Iran into Central Asia, and it will join and go all the way out to at least Beijing, if not to Shanghai. It's an incredible project. Alongside this huge project is a pipeline project. When there was, again, these sanctions against Russia, the Russians and Chinese had a huge meeting late last year, and then again early this year, where they discussed a long-term energy strategy for the two countries. To have Russian energy be delivered directly through pipelines into China. And there is, of course, has been a long-standing talk of Asian pipelines for Iranian gas. Remember when Condoleezza Rice came to Delhi in 2005, and she said, we're going to bring you out of the nuclear cold, but you have to vote for us in the IAEA. And you have to stop a process known as the peace pipeline. This was a project which goes back, as long as I can remember, which was to run from the Fars gas field in Iran, a pipeline through Pakistan into India. And it was called the peace pipeline. This is kind of Thomas Friedman-esque. Thomas Friedman had a theory about the Golden Arches theory of conflict resolution. I don't know if you've read his brilliant books, but the theory is if two countries have McDonald's, they won't go to war. That book came out, I think, in 1998, 99, and then within a month, India and Pakistan went to war in Kargil, and both had McDonald's. So much for the Golden Arches theory. But the theory with the pipeline was if there's a pipeline running through three countries, each of the countries will have less of, or maybe this would provide at least some stimulus or some incentive not to raise the temperature for war between the countries, because they have a lot at stake together. Now, I know this is also as silly as the Golden Arches theory, because after all, between Colombia and its neighbors, there have been pipelines running, and nonetheless, there have been border skirmishes and wars. So this is as silly of an argument. Nonetheless, this was the language from the 70s, 80s into the 90s, that if India and Pakistan could only have more commercial ties, then the politics will disappear. I don't agree with this way of thinking, but this was the way of thinking in the language. So Rice said openly in Delhi at a press conference, we submit that instead of this pipeline, which will be very unstable, you develop a civilian nuclear program. Standing next to her was the Indian foreign minister of the time, Mr. Natwar Singh, who embarrassed the Americans, and this became a backdoor problem, because he said India and Iran have historical ties. We are a people who are united by, the pabulum. We are united by centuries of connection, etc., which actually is true, but nonetheless, it was embarrassing. Okay. So this second problem for the economic weapon is the pipeline equation, which is a long-term equation, but nonetheless means that there is an expiry date in the medium to long term for this very powerful weapon, which is economic sanctions. One, because of the new financial architecture that will be created, and secondly, because perhaps these pipelines will come to fruition. By the way, the train line is almost working. You can go most of the way from Lake Van to China. It's an incredible project, and it's been happening largely out of the notice of the press. Okay. Now, there's an interesting development, 10, 15 minutes more. There's an interesting development, because the question I had said to you was until about 2003, the Iranian nuclear issue was not a crisis. It's true that in 1995, the United States government had a sanctions policy against Iran. Conoco had a $1 billion contract to develop some oil fields in Iran, and the US passed the Iran and Libya Sanctions Act. By the way, that's another very interesting parallel. The United States, Iran, and Libya Sanctions Act, and they have very divergent histories of where this Sanctions Act comes out. Because Libya, almost right after the US law began to open channels with the West, in April of 1999, the UN sanctions were suspended on Libya. Libya began to open the door to pay for the Lockerbie air disaster, the terrorist attack on the plane. They said we'll pay for it. They suspended their nuclear program, and by 2006, Libya got off the US list of state sponsors of terrorism. In 2008, Libya paid $1.5 billion. George W. Bush signed order number 13477, and that insulated Libya from lawsuits. That was in 2008. Of course, in 2011, none of those deals mattered, and Libya is now what it is. These things are in the minds of people in Tehran. When they see these parallels, they're not naive. When they understand the implications of how the Libya-Iran Sanctions Act played out for these two countries. They're two very different countries, one much larger, much more powerful in its integration. The other, Libya, it's a completely different story. Okay. In 2003, in 2001 to 2003, the United States government did something very interesting, which we don't often talk about. The United States government went to war in two countries between 2001 and 2003 and knocked out Iran's two historical adversaries. First, it takes out the Taliban, which the Iranians hated, and basically opens the door from Tehran to Kabul, or at least to Herat. I mean, the entire western province of Afghanistan enters the sphere of influence of Iran. And it may surprise you to know that until a few years ago, when the last US government's report comes out on violations of sanctions on Iran, 50% of Afghan oil is bought directly from Iran. And about 20 to 25% of American troops' oil needs are bought from Iran. Because Afghanistan is a landlocked country, and the Americans would be crazy to fly in jumbo jets filled with oil, so they buy oil from the Iranians in the black market, which is coming right out of Herat, which essentially is another province of Iran. Meanwhile, in 2003, the United States government takes out Saddam Hussein. Now, some of you may know that from 1980 to 1988, Saddam Hussein, on behalf of the Gulf Arab states, prosecuted a long war against Iran, utilized chemical weapons, etc. It was a murderous, horrible war, the outcome of which was basically, the weakening of two countries. There was no victory for anybody, perhaps. Iran definitely deeply weakened by that war. It allowed the government in Tehran to deepen its hold in society. All adversaries inside were taken care of under the pretense of a war. I mean, it was Orwellian in its implications, that particular war. The Gulf Arabs promised $1 billion a month to the Iraqis. They reneged on the promise after 9 months. That war went on for 8 months. Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait. It's not the first time the Iraqis have laid claim to Kuwait. That happened with Qasim in the 1950s as well. Okay, let me just say that suddenly the Americans come in and they knock out two of Iran's historical adversaries. Iran, in 1991, was in a position where they could have done something but didn't. And this is revealing of the caged-in nature of Iran till 2003. In 1991, when the Americans came in and removed the Iraqi armies from Kuwait, whether by CIA push or whoever, there was a call for an uprising in the southern provinces of Iraq, and largely Shia uprising takes place in the marshes, in the historical district of Sumeria, and there's nobody to help them. There's no air cover. This is not to say the Americans didn't have the capacity. You might remember as the Republican Guard retreated along the highway of death, they were bombed by American planes, and about 17,000 Iraqi troops were slaughtered as they returned north deeper into Iraq. So it's not that they didn't have the capacity. At the time, there was a call made for Iran to intervene, and I just want to read you this little quote, maybe lesser known quote from Rafsanjani. And Rafsanjani publicly said, "We do not want to this is in 1991, we do not want to intervene in the internal affairs of Iraq. Our support only extends to the granting of refuge status to Iraqis fleeing their country. Our export of the revolution is not accomplished through war or the toppling of regimes. We export the revolution only by disseminating the thought of Imam Khomeini." Understand that in 1991, the country was in very bad shape. 2.5 years after the Iran-Iraq war had ended, it maybe didn't have the capacity to enter. And, you have to also remember that in 1991, there was a neoconservative faction in George H.W. Bush's circle who said, go all the way to Baghdad and then take a right turn to Tehran. And we just knock them all out in one go. And George H.W. Bush cautioned we don't want to do that. And in the breach, of course, the uprising in southern Iraq was crushed because nobody was going to come to their aid. Okay. Now, this changes, of course, in 2003. And not only does Iran get access now towards Herat and Afghanistan, but right up to the Mediterranean. And there's been several attempts, of course, to squelch Iranian influence in the region. Perhaps you might add to that the story of the 2006 war in Lebanon is part of that story. This is a political story. It is not a story about international, nuclear law. It's a political story which falls apart sometime this year. When the United States removes Saddam Hussein in 2003, they bring in an exiled group of people to take charge in Baghdad. People whose understanding of governance was framed in the exiles' world. It was a narrow dispensation. It narrowed the social fabric in a way, intensified contradictions, and the Americans, in a sense, contributed to the deepening sectarianization of Iraq, out of which provides a great opportunity for Iran. And hence you get this situation. I'm going to end with just one or two observations about the nuclear deal and this context, this geopolitical context. You know, there are times when you say things can be changed, and there are times when you say you have to take cognizance of reality and build a policy based on reality. One of the interesting features, I think, of the Obama administration with this Iran deal, if Obama didn't ever deserve the nuclear prize when he got it, I mean, he did nothing. If he didn't deserve it his entire career, this is something significant. There's nothing revolutionary in this deal. There's nothing, you know, that's going to, you know, improve the conditions of the whole of humanity. But it's going to lessen, I think, the obligation of a terrible escalation of conflict in the region. I think there is a modus vivendi coming into play. I fear that this is going to come on the backs of a lot of unfinished conflicts in the region. You know, where there are just claims that people have which are going to get squelched, perhaps just claims in Syria, perhaps just claims in Bahrain, perhaps just claims in Yemen. But it seems that there is a new modus vivendi already in place, and I think that the second piece of evidence, one was the summoning of the Pakistani Prime Minister, and the second was the noises from Saudi Arabia that they want to cut a deal with the South Koreans for a nuclear program, which has within it the level of absurdity, because that would take about 30 or 40 years. These seem to be positionings or bargaining moves rather than an attempt to create a new modus operandi in the region. I think there's an understanding that a grand bargain of some kind might perhaps be in the works, and a grand bargain which is less grand and more a bargain, which is less you know, about world-changing events and rather coming to terms with obvious realities that have been in place for over a decade. I think this deal is definitely going to go through, and I think one of the authors of that is Benjamin Netanyahu, who, you know, may win the election today or may not, but his arrival in Washington, D.C. has played a great role in getting this deal through. Because the one thing that the Republicans and some hawks in the Democratic Party could have done was to have joined together and written legislation that tightens the sanctions and overrides an Obama veto. But because Mr. Netanyahu came and because it became so deeply partisan and ugly, there will be not one Democratic senator who will vote with the Republicans on a new sanctions slate, which means Obama can easily veto any Republican bill which wants to increase sanctions. Secondly, I think the fact that 47 US Republicans, senators, wrote this letter to Iran has changed the tenor of the public understanding. And the hateful language that has come into this particular debate has emboldened the Obama administration. And I think it's in this context that you might see the statement made by John Kerry, where he said that the technical aspects of the negotiation are over. He said this on Sunday, and all that remains are the politics. What he means by the politics is interesting. He doesn't mean the geopolitics. I think he means tying up of loose ends. I think that's where they are. I fear that there will be no, I mean not fear, I think there will be no problem to this deal going through. I would have very low expectations of what this means, but perhaps it will reduce the temperature on the antagonisms in the region that I think have created more problems than provided solutions for ordinary people. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Vijay. But could you just quickly tell us how you think the Saudis are going to react to this? You didn't mention.
I would very much like the Saudi government to give me access to their country so I can walk beyond the immigration section of King Abdulaziz Airport and actually enter the country and talk to people there. For me, it's a black box. You'll have to ask other people to tell you what the Saudi government would say.
If anybody knows, please raise your hands. Anybody? Is it fun? Is there... Yeah.
Dr. Hasib, please don't allow me to sing anymore.
I have a number of questions to put to you. First one, why is this double standard by the Security Council and the United States as a whole? Why they don't talk about Israel having a number of nuclear bombs and they are pursuing Iran alone? Why this double standard? Second question is, are we likely that the United States will drop its objection to Iran as it did to Iran and Pakistan previously? They were objecting, then they conceded. The third, a lot of talk about the role of Saudi Arabia financing the nuclear bombs in Pakistan, and there are recent reports, I don't know, you know better than me, to what extent that Saudi Arabia is trying to get some nuclear bombs from Pakistan. And the last question, to what extent what the recent report are talking about that the United States will provide a nuclear umbrella to the Gulf countries as a protection against Iran? Thank you.
Yeah, those are great questions. I'll go through them backwards. The United States already provides a nuclear umbrella to the Gulf countries, most recently through the Carter Doctrine, which basically says that the threat to the Gulf is a threat to the United States of America, and lucky for the Gulf countries, the great Emirate of Qatar, for instance, houses a huge American base north of Doha and west of Doha. It's often rumored that in the very great country of Bahrain, there is always on base tactical nuclear weapons. So if you put the Carter Doctrine side by side with at least these two bases, I think there's already a nuclear umbrella for the Gulf countries. That's a fait accompli. I think in the 1970s, there was a terrifically paranoid documentary, which everybody should watch, called The Islamic Bomb, which was about Pakistani scientists, Libyan chaps with suitcases of cash. I don't know if you remember this, but there were dark, video images, grainy, in hotel rooms of suitcases roughly pushed across tables, and Pakistanis, I don't know how good they are at cricket, trying to catch the suitcase and then walking out. I mean, there has been this fantasy, and it is probably the case. We don't know, because the network of, Mr. Khan from Pakistan was itself lucrative, because he ran the nuclear program and was using a sale of proliferated material to finance the program. So whether there was a need for Saudi money is not relevant. On the other hand, very many elements of the Pakistani state rely entirely on Saudi disbursements, including the election campaign of the current Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif is entirely financed by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And as I said, every once in a while when there's a problem, they second him and he flies right to Riyadh, he meets with them. And in Bahrain, for instance, when they need new police officers, they put ads in Pakistani newspapers saying, if you hate the Shia, come to Bahrain and you can earn good money. I mean, literally, these are the ads. So, I think that the issue of the Islamic bomb is always on the table. I'm not sure that that's why they summoned Nawaz Sharif. I think he was summoned because there is this consolidation taking place, perhaps. The old consolidation from 1961 of the Organization of Islamic Countries You remember that Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan were the founders of it, of the World Muslim League. This is that old consolidation, I think. These are the prime interlocutors, and they keep getting revived when there's any tension. The double standards, that's the world we live in. The reason I went on about India and Iran is because I think they're a cleaner example. Because everybody knows that the moral certificate for Israel is given annually multiple times by the United States. John Kerry, again, I think in a moment of weakness when he was being challenged by Netanyahu, said that, I can name 120 times in the UN where we helped you out. And most recently over the Goldstone report, not most recently, but dramatically, where again Condoleezza Rice was going to, Ban Ki-moon was going to the capital saying that you cannot allow the Goldstone report to move in any way out of, the filing cabinet or the archive of the UN. So that moral certificate is inviolable, and I think that's just the way it's going to be for a while. So that's why I prefer the India and Iran example, because it leads to your second question, which is the question of drop objections to Iran. I don't think there is a political will in the West to drop objections to Iran, because the Iranian government continues to not be able to get a moral certificate from the West. However sophisticated their foreign minister, the West is not going to give them that moral certificate. All that will happen, I think, is if there's this 10-year caesura, 10-year, hudna kind of situation, you're going to get, after that, very major changes in the world architecture, different financial systems, different kind of pipeline arrangements, where 10 years from now it's going to be very hard to put economic pressure on Iran. So that's why if I was in the West, I would say this is the time not to sign a 10-year deal. This is the time to sign a grand bargain. Because in 10 years, you're going to have no instruments. You won't be able to attack them militarily, and the economic sanctions will be meaningless.
There's a couple of questions here and then over there.
What do you think are the implications, given the contradictions between Russia and America within China and so on, that if this deal goes through in any way, shape or form through the Security Council, that they can never go back to the Security Council and bring it to where it is today?
Yeah. And the gentleman behind, let's just take a couple, there's a lot of questions.
To what extent do you believe a positive deal between Iran and P5+1 will fasten the operations against ISIS and the political solution for Syria?
And one more.
Kevork. Good afternoon. Marwan, how are you?
Hello. I want to ask you about the political aspect of the deal. You said that Kerry said the technical aspects are over and we have the political aspects that remain. What about opening to Assad? Is that one of it? And what about the sanctions? Khamenei said that we will not be okay with only sanctions being removed from the UN. We need them to be removed from Congress and the EU. Will that happen?
Okay. Tariq, I don't think the deal is going to go through the UN Security Council. This is a P5+1 deal with Iran. If this is like a 10-year thing, I don't know who has the appetite to go there. This is not going to remove all the sanctions. There will be some arrangement. Some things will go, some things will remain. I don't think, Felipe will know better than I. It's very unlikely that they will go to the Security Council. It's very risky. Nobody wants to, having spent this time getting some agreement, you don't want to have a situation where a veto appears on the table. Nobody, I think, has the appetite for that. I think the moral climate on this is lowered. That's how I see it. There is a kind of exhaustion. Your questions are related in a way. I feel that this is the reality. I don't think that the deal has enabled, let's say, General Soleimani's photographs to appear in the press, on the outskirts of Tikrit. I think that's just a reality. Whether there was a deal or not, that was going to happen. I think the fact that the photographs appeared is an indicator of some more confidence. Because after all, let's just put General Soleimani in context. When the United States decided to go to war in Afghanistan in, maybe late September, when plans were afoot, the Iranians were very much involved. Between October, when the bombing begins, and January 2002, General Soleimani's Al-Quds force was operational in Herat. They were on the ground, they were operating the stuff that he normally does, whatever he does, strategic, battlefield, tactical things. They were on the ground with the Americans. The Americans weren't there. But they were there with Ismail Khan. I mean, Ismail Khan is not capable of having taken Herat back. The Iranians moved with Ismail Khan, put him back in Herat. In 2002, George W. Bush gives the axis of evil speech. Soleimani goes back to Tehran. That's the end of that coordination. So I don't think the Iranians have a principled objection to working with the Americans against their adversary. I don't think there's, I mean, that Soleimani episode to me demonstrates there's no principled opposition. They'll be quite happy to work with the Americans. They have a pragmatic approach to this. And so in Iraq, the fact that it's so public, I mean, that his pictures are put on the mausoleum or mosque of Saddam Hussein reveals a confidence. That actually gives me pause. I think that may not be the best approach for the region to so boldly go forth. It might be better to go back to some of the more modest approaches. Because this is the reality. It's just that now there's a little more confidence. That's how I would read that. Because Soleimani has had no problem being ordered into the field with the Americans. The thing about the state is very interesting, is in the same moment when he says that the nuclear deal is done, yes, you're right, he says the politics remain, and then he makes these comments about the Damascus government. It's an interesting moment. And by the way, I tried to follow the reports on this in the United States. That was less interesting to the press. It may be more interesting in this region. But again, that's a fait accompli. They're not actually, there's not a policy there's no policy change. This seems to have been a drift. I mean, the Americans have been drifting for the last 2 years in the belief that, you know, there is going to have to be some entente. Obama has not had a policy that's coherent, and the ground has not also afforded him a policy. It's not fair to just say, the Americans didn't do this, the Americans didn't do that. The ground has not afforded a policy. I mean, most recently, the most recent moderate force was overrun. Where's the ground giving them a policy? There is no handle. So in that sense, I think this is also a fait accompli. And I feel that that is why there is an understanding that between Saudi Arabia and Iran, if there is some bargain, it may not be very grand, then the so-called crises in Yemen, in Syria, at least these two will have some reasonable actors able to manage them. Libya is a completely different story. It's an entirely different scenario, and I don't think this bargain is going to have any impact on Libya. It's an utterly different scene. These actors don't play there as powerfully as others. Saudi Arabia does, yes, Qatar does, Egypt does, the Trans-Saharan smuggling network does. It's different from this. So I think there's a lot of fait accompli that they are now publicly talking about. Some questions?
Who else has questions?
Well, there is some optimism in your talk about what follows from the deal. Maybe he deserves the Peace Award based on that. But that would involve some kind of a Taif agreement, but at a regional level. And that would involve the major two players, Iran and Saudi Arabia, for that kind of sectarian conflict sponsored by those two states to ease down, to settle. Now, that requires more involvement. Yes, to come up with such agreement. And
more agreement from the U.S.?
No, more involvement, more arm twisting from the U.S.
Okay.
So in that sense, we have to advocate for more involvement of the U.S. in the region, not less involvement. Because without that, those two countries will not be capable of achieving any kind of agreement. So that's one thing we have to encourage, including arm twisting. Now, given your theory, that will be done only if the interests of the U.S. are achieved, as well as those two theocratic and dictatorial countries. And I see in that kind of scenario, if you see the U.S. playing only kind of that role, I don't see any advancement of just claims. You can see some kind of Sykes-Picot between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the U.S. as a sponsor, but nothing more fruitful than that. It becomes at the expense of the Bahraini people and the Syrian people, all of that. So in that sense, I don't see we should be very joyful about this kind of deal. Maybe it's better than the continuance of killing. That's more the reality, but let's be frank. I mean, if you want to go along with the criticism of the US and its alliance with dictatorial states, this is part of that. And only a US that could protect civilian Syrians, as it did with the Kurds. Only that kind of US policy we should be able to give a Nobel Prize for, and not this kind of alliance with theocratic, brutal dictators.
Prashad, you entirely summarized my presentation except the beginning and the end. Meaning it's true, this is not a happy situation. As I said earlier, there will be the squanderings of the claims of people in various countries. You know, I had mentioned Syria and Bahrain, which you mentioned again. This is true, but these are not the only places. Yemen as well. You know, there are lots of unfinished just claims that will not be on this particular check. That is true. That is the best scenario. You see, in 1999, to give you an analogy, Hugo Chavez attempted a coup d'etat. No, sorry, 1994, two. He attempted a coup d'etat. It failed. It was on the backs of the Caracazo, the big uprising in 1989. Thousands of people shot dead in the streets of Caracas. And he, after the coup failed, he came on TV and he said, I take complete responsibility for this coup. And he said, everybody go home por ahora, for now. That's a great line. That became the campaign slogan for him in 1998 when he won a huge majority. Sometimes in history, you take a step back and say, for now, those claims are not going to be tended, and wait for another day. I mean, it's not clear that this time now is not come for at least some caesura and deep breath, because it seems that these claims will not be won, Bashar, through bloodshed. And so, you know, in history there are moments of pause. And I'm not speaking at all as a conservative, quite the opposite. I just feel like, you know, cold-hearted reality has its role to play in our analysis of the future.
Then we'll go up.
Yeah, in your opinion, will Iran acquire nuclear weapons sometime in the future? And if it does, will that be a stabilizing or destabilizing influence? And thirdly, you did mention in your speech something about Iran in 2006 war in Lebanon, but you left it hanging. You didn't elaborate. Maybe you could do that.
Well, the expert on the 2006 war is sitting next to me, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. The question of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons I cannot give you an answer to that, because that's a question of the future and they may or may not. But at least there are two pieces of evidence that suggest that there is not an enormous appetite for nuclear weapons. One piece of evidence is during the Iran-Iraq war, it is on record, it is documented record that the Iraqis used chemical weapons against the Iranians. They used mustard gas, they used, I think, chlorine gas in very large quantities and killed, you know, I don't know how many Iranians died in waves of attack against the Iraqis, you know, suicidal attack in a way. At several points, they could have retaliated with chemical weapons. You know, how hard is it to make a chemical weapon? It's not. I mean, it's really not hard. It's hard to stabilize the weapon. It's not hard to make it. They refused to retaliate with chemical weapons. And I know this because they keep telling you that. They said, you know, we could have, we never did, because we don't believe in it. Because Khomeini had written a fatwa saying no chemical weapons. Robert Collier of the San Francisco Chronicle, Rami, Robert Collier, I think he was in the San Francisco Chronicle. Collier traveled to Qom in 2003 and, you know, interviewed, I don't know, 10 or 15 leading clerics and asked them, what is your position on weapons of mass destruction? And he said there was a universal consensus in the religious establishment against it. Now, I mean, I'm not naive, you know, you can change religious view overnight, I know that. But on the other hand, there is at least this to hold on to. Now, this is not much, because the West is insisting on a character certificate, moral character certificate. So they would say Ahmadinejad has said genocidal things. Therefore, the Iranians can't, you know, the whole country cannot be trusted because a man now out of office said genocidal things. Well, you know, south of here, Avigdor Lieberman has said Palestinians should be beheaded, and every few days there's some horrible things said south of here. But somehow the character certificate for Israel is inviolable, as I said. So it's very hard to say, A, answer your question, and B, even if you could answer the question, it's not clear that that's sufficient to earn Iran a good character certificate. Those kids in school who the teachers always see as bad. Whatever the kid does, they come in dressed well, the kid says, I'm on your plan. Today you didn't have egg on your clothes. You're trying to get me somehow.
Yeah, hi. So you said before that the partisan speech by Netanyahu before Congress was definitely affecting the voting decisions of Democrats in Congress, right? My question is very simple. How will this speech, like the fact of having the Prime Minister of Israel speaking before Congress, right, when the negotiations are taking place in Switzerland, how will this speech affect the negotiations? Thank you.
Any other questions in that area? Anyone else up there?
My question is about the implication of that on Turkey, especially in regards to their energy interest and their implication in Syria.
Wow.
Is there something related to this?
Please. Good state. Okay. Negotiations are interesting. I have their journalistic colleagues sitting in Geneva, and they sit on sofas outside, and they watch the smiles, the body language. If Zarif comes out and he's holding somebody, who's holding whom, who's smiling more. It's an incredible game. I remember this once when the former Iraqi Deputy Prime Minister, Tariq Aziz, came to India, and he came walking out with the Indian Foreign Minister, and he was holding the Indian Foreign Minister like this. Indian Foreign Minister was walking along like that. And all my colleagues were speculating, what does this mean? Well, it just means that Tariq Aziz is an affectionate fellow. He grabbed Indian Foreign Minister is from South India. He was like, don't hold me this tightly. It's interesting that the negotiations continued. It didn't seem to impact what was happening in Geneva. It didn't seem to impact what was happening in Geneva. It's very hard to tell. These are closed doors. They are discussing things. They say things in public when they walk out to try to influence the negotiations, draw public opinion, to win people over on their side. Negotiations aren't a simple matter. They're very complicated. There are little details, there are big picture things. There are side agreements that are going on that will not be reflected on a document. There'll be political things they'll agree on, which they're not going to write down. So these are very complicated things, and I was very interested in the kind of banality of Netanyahu's speech. There was nothing there. I thought Nancy Pelosi, senior Democrat, when she made the comment that he condescended to the intelligence of Americans, I think that was spot on. That he didn't contribute to an analysis of the regional political situation. He didn't contribute to an analysis of the security question. He didn't really offer anything different. And I think she was spot on, and I think that the fact that a senior Democrat of her stature can say something like that in public should indicate to you the cementing of partisanship, which, there are small things you hold on to, and I think that's one of them. So that's how I would see. The Turkey thing is so hard to grasp. It's such a great country. It's got such a strange political period now. Such an odd political establishment. Not really sure what happens to a power which has ambitions thwarted by reality. And really irreconcilable imagination. You don't want to reconcile yourself with some changed situations. And some of it might have to do with the Kurdish question, but I don't think that's all of it. It's incredible that the Erdogan government over the last 5-6 years had its own major grand bargain for Turkey, which was the Imrali process, where essentially Öcalan had agreed on a number of the Turkish demands, and Turkey had agreed to a number of the Kurdish demands. They were low-level agreement, but it would have been an enormous relief, I think, for a lot of people who live in in Turkey, in the Kurdish lands. It would have been an enormous relief. You know, the Kurdish movements had been under pressure for a decade or more by the existence of the autonomous Kurdish Republic in Iraq. I think there was, interest from that. There's also exhaustion. How many years can you carry an insurgency? You know, in the jungles in Colombia, FARC is sitting at the table having a serious discussion with the Colombian government, again, to come above ground, to stop, have some kind of deal. You can't continue prosecute these kind of wars for more than 1, 2, 3 generations. It exhausts people to be sitting in a forest fighting a guerrilla war. So FARC is closing down their war. They want a bargain. I mean, the Imrali process, if it had come through, would have been, I think, a great relief to a lot of people. You know, your maximalist demands cannot always be met. You have to come to some agreement and then come back tomorrow with other demands and other claims. So I think that the Turkish government was at the threshold of a new day. And I fear that the problem with, old imaginations reappearing really mess up your foreign policy calculations. And, one sees that in Libya, where the role of Turkey and Qatar, and then on the other side, Saudi Arabia, are continuing to, I think, inflame a country that doesn't need information. You know, the UN recently said there are 1,500 separate, not militias, but political armed parties in Libya. 1,500. You know, it was one of the most, interesting places, beautiful country. Fine, idiosyncratic and crazy and authoritarian and dictatorial, and especially after the 1990s, megalomaniac leader, fine, no problem, that was what he was. And, indeed, it is not the place to have nostalgia for somebody like that, but the nature of the collapse, this precipitous collapse should bring you to Rafsanjani's comment, that perhaps it's not a good idea to overthrow governments entirely by war like this, I mean, and the Turks are continuing to be involved there. And I hope very much that if there is some bargain on this latitude between these two powers, it was in, let me just say a side thing, in the Cold War, shall we say, between Riyadh and Tehran, it emboldened countries like Qatar to assert themselves. There was a lot more space for independent foreign policy. It also helped Qatar that their, so-called regional allies were advantaged by the electoral process, meaning the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, if you go to Tunis, you will be shocked to see the huge building that Nahda owns. And Nahda owns, right in the center of town. It's a marginal, small exiles party who suddenly owns a magnificent building. They saw themselves as a player suddenly. And I think if this meridian begins to dial it down even a little, I think dialing downs may happen. I don't know. It's very hard to tell how to read the Turkish landscape fully.
Other questions?
Kurdish state question I answered already.
Thanks, Vijay. I'd like you to talk a little bit about your other favorite topic, the BRICS, which you brought up, but only in the kind of a long-term geological transformation of the architecture of the world.
What hydraulic?
How about a hydraulic interpretation of the more kind of immediate potential and possibilities of the BRICS involvement in this bipolar world that you're describing, or tripolar world that you're describing?
So, for the last 10 years, I've pursued, whenever I go to interview or follow an international conference, I always like to go immediately to the ambassadors from the BRICS countries. I like to go and especially harass the Brazilians, who are perhaps the most sophisticated foreign service in the world. I mean, there are two countries who don't deserve the foreign service they have. One is Brazil, the other is Egypt. I mean, incredibly competent and smart, officers of the foreign service. I mean, I'm always, bedazzled by their intelligence and curiosity and whatever. Until recently, the one foreign service that very rarely liked to tell you what they feel were the Chinese. And in the last 2 years, I have been struck, I mean, I think we've discussed this. I've been struck by the Chinese, for instance, saying, we are appalled by what's happening in Syria. The word appalled. I mean, I never thought I'd heard a diplomat from, the Chinese foreign ministry using words like appalled. I'm appalled by what's happening in Syria. I think what's happening with ISIS is unbelievable. It's outrageous. I mean, these are the words that I used. Immoral was the other thing. I think, the Chinese have for a long time had the view of, don't speak much, but don't carry a big stick either. Just try to influence things. And I have a very strong feeling that one of the miscalculations perhaps of the West over Ukraine, which, they may be legitimate, whatever's going on, I don't follow that at all. I mean, maybe a big Western plot, whatever's going on, I'm not aware of what's happening. But I do know that the miscalculation is that, I'll backtrack a little. In the Cancun meeting in 2003, which was over the Singapore issues of the Doha round of development, where they were discussing things like subsidies and, boring things like that about trade. Boring and inconsequential things like prices of food grains. Okay. India, Brazil, South Africa first created the IBSA group because they had a, joint problem with how the negotiations were proceeding. For the history of Chinese diplomacy, they always were the plus C. So it was always the G77, the bloc of the South, plus C. It was always IBSA plus C. They didn't want to join any group. When in 2006 they joined the process that becomes BRICS, I was actually very surprised. The miscalculation is that the Chinese have felt for, I think, the Bush period, that they are considered, and the Americans say this openly, China is a threat, rising China, got to engage China, their military spending is too much. But they didn't react in any way except against Japan. Island skirmishes, etc. When Russia made the approach last year for tightening the security architecture and starting military exercises together, the Chinese agreed. So when I wrote my book on BRICS, I'd said one of the limitations of BRICS is they have no military ambitions, or no military capacity. This surprised me, that they are now going to start doing military exercises together in warm water areas of the world. That means not up in the Baltics, not in the North China Sea. They're going to go and do exercises elsewhere. I mean, this is a new world we've entered. They are more confident. I'm not necessarily confident that the vision they're going to provide is going to be a good one. All that I believe is that they are providing an alternative to unipolarity. It's merely an institutional, opportunity. Their own vision is not a progressive or interesting one to me. The issue is going to be what the rest of the world is capable of doing with the opening provided now from unipolarity to at least bipolarity. In the 1950s, the rest of the world created the non-aligned movement, seeing the opportunity of bipolarity. My interest is, will the rest of the world be up to it now? And this part of the region needs to be on that bandwagon. You can't leave everything to the South Americans.
I think we will end as we began. One last question.
Oh, great.
I have two more questions to put to you. One, it's said that even after agreement between Iran and the 5+1 about nuclear, the position of Iran is going to be similar to that of Japan. Japan has the capabilities of having a nuclear bomb within 6 months or to 1 year, less or minor, and that Iran will have the same thing. What do you say about it? The other question, there is a strong point of view to which I adhere myself. What we are seeing about negotiations between Iran and 5+1 is a part of a grand Ethiopia, the and Egypt and Ethiopia were quarreling for the last 3-4 years about the Nahda Dam. Suddenly, they are agreeing. President are going next week to Saudi. In Syria, United States and they were trying to down Bashar al-Assad, and suddenly, 2 days ago, Kerry says that we have to deal with Bashar, we have to find a political solution, etc. And what's happening in Iraq, what's happening? Do you think this is, regardless of what they say, it's a grand deal by all parties concerned? Thank you.
By the way, let me just say that I'm happy that the first 4 questions and the last 2 questions came from Carol-Din Hasib of the Center for Arab Unity Studies, our senior colleague. Now, having said that, I am not willing to move from the very narrow bargain, which I wasn't even willing to call a grand bargain, to this giant bargain that you're imagining that goes from Ukraine to Ethiopia. I'm not sure that the powers that be have either the will or imagination or stamina to make any kind of deal like that. I think sometimes we overestimate their intelligence and power. I think very often they make deals on the very short term. And sometimes short-term deals have longer-term effects. Bashar is now gone, but he referred to 2 historical agreements and made parallels with them. One was TAF, 1989-90, and second was Sykes-Picot. I mean, it's incredible to say that the current bargain at this low level can be related to TAF. Now, is TAF an agreement, or is it, as some people say, a halftime? You know, a very senior security official said that it's not an agreement, it's a halftime in Lebanon. So, you know, what is it? Is Sykes-Picot revoked? As Walid Jumblat said, you know, he received from Hassan Nasrallah a book about the Sykes-Picot agreement, when the day after the videos emerged of ISIS breaking down the barriers between Iraq and Syria, you know, that was a gift he was given. And then he said, Sykes-Picot, oh, is this the new Sykes-Picot? These are all regional modus vivendis. These are not big plans to help save the world. The current governors of the world don't know how to save the world. That's for the people to do.
Okay. Just before we close, just to thank everybody at IFI who set this up, the communications team, Rima Rasi, I don't know who else I've forgotten, but everybody. And of course, Vijay and Rayan. And of course, Vijay, thank you for coming and come back to visit us.